Iran has been within 2 weeks of a nuclear weapon for as long as I can remember.
But at what point does especially China get more involved in the action?
If that were to happen, we're on the threshold of intercontinental nuclear exchanges. The reason we're in this war is because Israel and its Zionist billionaire supporters in the United States currently control Congress and the president.
How does the United States benefit from this conflict in any manner?
It doesn't.
Folks, as I talk to you right now, World War III might be around the corner. Missiles are flying from different countries, bombs are exploding, people are dying, things are getting serious, and I wanted to talk to somebody that can help us understand what's going on in our world. So on the show, we're having an interview with Colonel Douglas Macgregor. He served in the military for almost 30 years. He's a West Point graduate, and some people have called him one of the most innovative minds in the military today. He is joined by Zoom, so this is just a Zoom call, but I think the information is key. We could have flown to DC and done a podcast-style interview, but right now I think information that is powerful and quick is the best. So tune into this as you're working, going for a run, and learn about what's going on in our world. I'm very concerned about this battle in Iran. I'm very concerned about our alliance with Israel, and I think Colonel Macgregor fills in a lot of gaps and gives us a comprehensive understanding that only someone with almost 30 years of experience in the business can do. Tune in to Douglas Macgregor, but first, a quick word from the sponsor of today's episode. Folks, before we dive in, first a quick word from the sponsor of today's episode, Proof Wallet. Every real man needs a real wallet, and Proof delivers just that. In an age where it feels like everything is made from cheap crap, Proof does the exact opposite. They use genuine leather and aerospace grade metal to craft their wallets. This is a veteran owned company that takes pride in craftsmanship. They have a minimalist design that you can fill up to 25 cards in here without it feeling bulky, and it also comes with RFID blocking technology that helps protect your cards from scammers. What separates Proof from the pack is their customer service. If this wallet gets lost or stolen, they replace it for free. To get one for yourself, visit go.carryproof.com/TommyG and use code TommyG for 20% off your entire order. That's right, use code TommyG for 20% off your entire order. Thank you, and back to the episode.
Colonel, thank you for joining us. I know that you're getting a lot of calls right now. The first thing I want to get into is understanding why we're in this conflict in the first place, from the Trump administration's point of view, and then if it differs from your point of view as well.
Well, listen, people can go and listen to Hegseth and Trump and whatever they have to say. I'm not going to repeat that drivel. I'm going to tell you that the reason we're in this war is because Israel and its Zionist billionaire supporters in the United States currently control Congress and the president. They invested enough money to ensure that everyone on the Hill will support whatever Israel wants. And they invested enough money in Trump that he was able to be elected in 2024. Those are the facts. So we are effectively in this war to remove Iran as an obstacle to Israel's regional hegemony.
Now, if you say that to a congressperson or to someone that's in AIPAC, they're going to say that that is a conspiracy theory. That's the
Well, it's not a theory. It's a fact. All you have to do is look at the 100+ million that have been invested in the Congress by the Zionist billionaires. Because if you just look at what AIPAC says it spends on lobbying, that's about $3 million, which is a modest sum. You have to look at the direct payments that go into political action committees to ensure the candidates are elected. You have to understand that a candidate who says they're not prepared to support whatever Israel wants knows that whoever his opponent is will then be offered the same money regardless of party, as long as he or she supports whatever Israel wants. It's a very simple process. It's worked brilliantly because they've had almost inexhaustible funds to invest. Now, all the nonsense about Israel is the first, or not Israel, but Iran is the leading state sponsor of terrorism, that's all nonsense. If you're looking for an Islamist state that sponsors terrorism, that advocates for the use of force against anyone who is not a Muslim for all intents and purposes, but certainly against Israel, against the United States and Europe, go to Pakistan. Pakistan is a world-renowned incubator of Islamist terrorists. Their madrasas, religious schools, are heavily funded by the Saudis that push this Wahhabist extremist Islam. And they very definitely fall into the category. Of course, Pakistan has nuclear weapons, which suggests that if you want to avoid being disrupted or invaded or attacked by the United States and Israel, you probably ought to invest in nuclear weapons.
Which is what they're using.
Iran has made it very clear that they will not build a nuclear weapon. That was declared an impossibility almost 20 years ago by the man who is now dead, the former supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. We decided on the basis of Israeli propaganda and direction to say that we don't believe them and they're lying. You've got to go back and look at Mr. Netanyahu's record as a good example over many, many decades. Iran has been within 2 weeks of a nuclear weapon for as long as I can remember. Mm-hmm. Iran is a terrorist and wants to kill everyone who is not a Muslim. It's all nonsense. We forget that, for instance, this man Soleimani, who was the leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps back in 2005 and 2006, was instrumental in taking the Shiite population led by the famous mullah, whose name escapes me at this point, out of the fight so that Petraeus could pay off the Sunnis and the Shiites would stop fighting to allow for some measure of stability to put in a government. And that government turned out to be pro-Iranian under Mr. Maliki. People have forgotten that. Then Mr. Soleimani came back into the country to organize the Iraqi Shiite militias to fight against ISIS, whom we declared to be our enemy, and Al-Qaeda, and Al-Nusra, and all these Sunni Islamist organizations. They were allied with us. And Soleimani actually went into Syria with these Shiite militias and liberated Christian and Druze and other towns occupied by Armenians and Georgians and so forth. We murdered him. That was our gratitude for his good work, because Israel wanted him dead, because he was opposing everything Israel wanted to achieve. What I'm trying to tell you is that we've just got lie after lie after lie after lie spewing out of people's mouths. And, I keep telling people, and they listen in Europe, they listen in the Middle East, and they certainly listen in India. If you want to stop Islamist terrorism, the first place you look is Pakistan, not Iran. And I am not advocating war with Pakistan. I'm just trying to expose fiction that people are repeating ad nauseum.
So as it stands right now, it appears 3 different U.S. military bases have been taken out. The Burj Khalifa has gotten hit by a drone or a missile. We've bombed a school in Iran where school children are dead. Apparently, Trump has sunk up to 9 Iranian naval ships. What do you make of the carnage so far, and where do you predict it's going to go?
Well, actually, the Iranians have destroyed 27 bases in the region.
27 now.
27. They actually attacked our air base in Kirlik, Turkey, which has been a key hub for U.S. air power across the entire region for decades. And that is no longer usable. We also need to remember that when we say destroy, it doesn't take much to damage an airstrip or airstrips. In other words, to render many of these bases inoperable is not difficult. Now, the 5th Fleet's base has been utterly and completely destroyed, seriously pulverized by multiple missiles. In many other cases, they've used relatively cheap, inexpensive drones that our air defenses have failed to shoot down. And when I say ours, I'm talking about the air defenses we established in UAE and other Gulf states using Patriot missiles and so forth. Of course, Patriot missile, if you fire it at 2 or 3 drones, is a pretty bad exchange rate, because you're spending millions of dollars to shoot down a couple of $100,000 worth of equipment. But they've managed to also damage all the port facilities that we have historically used, even port facilities in Oman. And we were building a port facility in Oman that was supposed to replace the one we've been using in Dubai. And the reason for that was very understandable. We were looking at the vulnerability of the port facilities, and we needed someplace else where we could reload Tomahawk missiles and strike missiles from the Navy, the whole SM family. Right now, we've lost all of those. And the impact on our logistical infrastructure is huge, because you're talking about having to fall all the way back to ports in India or ports in Europe because you can't use the ports that are in the Middle East. And then beyond those that have been destroyed or damaged, most of the countries in the Middle East have now turned away from us. And I think that's going to be the future. If I were going to predict the future right now, I think we will be swept completely out of the Middle East by the time this war ends. We will be finished in the region.
Do you predict this being a short-term conflict or something that is going to be long-term and ongoing?
I think this is going to go on for weeks, maybe months. We just don't know. Remember when we started the Kosovo conflict, the bombing campaign, that was supposed to last, as I recollect, 2 to 3 days, maybe a week, 2 weeks at most. Well, it lasted for 78 days. And the bombing campaign did not drive the Serbs out of Kosovo. We sent Strobe Talbot to Moscow, and he cut a deal, as President Trump would say, with the leadership in Moscow that agreed that they would tell the Serbs that they could not provide them with food, fuel, and medicine through the winter. And at that point, Milosevic, who was then the widely demonized leader of Yugoslavia or Serbia, recognized that he had to get the troops out because he didn't want to watch several 100,000 of his countrymen starve or freeze to death in the winter, because we bombed all the energy grids, all the heating plants, and so forth. This time around, you're in a somewhat different position because you have an enemy that is far better armed with much more modern technology than anything we faced in Serbia in 1999. And thus far, the Iranians seem to be doing very, very well. I think their next step is to essentially eliminate all the air and ground facilities in Israel for the Israeli armed forces, and force the Israelis to essentially fight from the ground without having much access to launch aircraft.
Do you think Israel is going to get absolutely pounded over the next few days?
I think it has been already, and it's going to continue nonstop. I'm told that President Trump actually sent a message over the weekend to the Iranians offering them an opportunity to negotiate. And they said not only no, but hell no. And I think they've had it with us, because once again, this latest attack did not begin with us. And we need to back up a little bit. I've been saying for months, ever since the 12-day war ended, that this would recommence. In other words, the war between Israel and Iran and us would recommence. I thought it would happen just before Christmas. It didn't. Then it became clear that it was probably going to happen in January. We saw these demonstrations, which were grossly inflated in their importance. We lied about what had happened over there, arguing that tens of thousands have been killed, which is a lot of nonsense, including, large numbers of police. Well, ultimately what happened is that they did kill the demonstrators, about 400 policemen, but we know that happened because the Mossad was on the ground with weapons and passed them out and urged people to shoot them, paid people to shoot them in some cases. And the demonstrations were not about overthrowing the government. They were protests about the sad state of the economy, largely as a consequence of our sanctions. And the government didn't disagree with them and said, we're doing everything we can. And they were negotiating a deal or a loan with China for $1 billion to boost the economy. As it turned out, all the killing made that impossible. But only about 3,000 people were killed. Some were jailed. But what we told was a lie at the time about what was going on. But I think the lie was actually believed in the White House. And I think President Trump actually thought, well, this is the moment we should be prepared to attack. But it was shut down so dramatically, particularly after the Iranians discovered, thanks to Chinese and Russian intelligence, where the 40,000 Starlight terminals were that the Mossad had smuggled into the country for use by their agents and the opposition. Once those were shut down and they'd eliminated most of the agents or the ringleaders, then it all ended. Right now, the only demonstrations we've seen since that time, and including yesterday, involve millions of people demonstrating support for the government. So I think it should be pretty clear now that what President Trump expected at the time wasn't real. Now, we heard from Mr. Witkoff quite recently that he, in private with Mr. Trump, concluded that it was very strange to them that the Iranians had not capitulated simply on the basis of assembling all of the American military power. And he said, "Whoa, why? We thought they were going to submit." You begin to wonder who the hell is really in charge. And I think we know who that is. That's Netanyahu. And Witkoff and friends are all surrogates for Netanyahu. Utterly false assumption about how the Iranians think or how they would behave. Iran will not submit to Israeli Jewish supremacy over the region. They won't do it. They won't submit to it over them. And I think they are now increasingly going to be backed by most of the region. And we are desperate. I think Trump called this inaccurately. I'm not sure what kind of advice he got. I doubt seriously he listened to anybody that told him about the limitations on our missiles, how many we had, how many we could produce to replace the ones we shot, and so forth. And I think he also failed to listen to people that told him what we could do from the sea and what we can't do from the sea. The outcome is now a war that is just dragging on without any end in sight.
Can you go on a little bit more about the miscalculations you suspect this Trump White House has made in this conflict and how that could result?
I'm told that we have something in the neighborhood of 4,000 to 5,000 missiles in the region right now. Many of those are Tomahawks, some are Standard missiles. Against that, you have 250,000 missiles on the Iranian side. There are many different categories, and the numbers are different in each, but the point is they have vastly more missiles than we do. And remember, they're a continental power. That means they're a land power. Their logistical supply chain is very short. Their manufacturing facilities are all underground, and they're continuing to turn out missiles. They also had the Chinese deliver many hundreds of missiles over the last few weeks. And these missiles are very accurate, very lethal. They're compatible with the launchers that the Iranians have. So I think there was a tendency to brush that aside. I think they thought that the Iranian air and missile defenses would fail completely. Well, actually speaking, they're starting to perform finally better than they have in the past. And I think that that's enough to deter people from entering Iranian airspace. The one area where I'm told that we have actually crossed into Iran, along with the Israelis, is up near Tabriz in the very northwest corner of the country. So the point is, I think we've misjudged. We've misjudged our production capacity, our ability to keep up. We keep forgetting that for every missile that's incoming, you fire 2 or 3 to try and knock it down. We have not kept up with the technological developments that they have achieved in Iran. One of their newer missiles that's had great success deploys a dozen or so decoys. And while the various anti-missile missiles are being fired in Israel or by us, the real missiles that are the real dangerous ones that you want to try and stop penetrate. In other words, they have gamed this very effectively, and their penetrations have been effective. And they've used cheap, inexpensive drones wherever possible, and they've managed to essentially shut down the economy in the United Arab Emirates, shut down Bahrain, shut down Kuwait, shut down Qatar. These are not minor matters, because India does billions and billions and billions of dollars of business through Dubai, through the UAE. 18% of the economy in the United Arab Emirates is tied up with aviation. Right now, no one can land or take off. I mean, I could keep going down the list, and you've seen what's happened with oil. Oil is spiking. Remember, capital always flees conflict and crisis and migrates to stability. We've destroyed stability. We've destroyed confidence in the staying power of the Emirates and I think Saudi Arabia. I'm told just before I came on here that a refinery in Saudi Arabia is on fire. Mm-hmm. If they start destroying refineries and oil infrastructure, and I think that's what's going to happen, it's going to have a terrible impact. It's going to take years to recover from this. And the Iranians have no incentive, none whatsoever, to believe anything we say. We've lied to them repeatedly. And the way this war started, actually, according to Secretary of State Rubio, he spoke to the so-called Group of Eight yesterday. He apparently said, well, you know, the Israelis got this started, and we decided we'd go ahead and join in. In other words, this was not a carefully coordinated, orchestrated beginning. And what were they able to do? They were able to kill the supreme leader. Well, what happens when you fire a CEO? You get a new one. You know, we need to wake up. This is not a personality cult in Iran. This is a real modern state. They have ample succession procedures in place. One commander replaces another based on the casualties. This is not some backward sultanate in the Middle Ages that you lose the sultan and everyone falls apart. So I think all of the assumptions we made about Iran at this point are wrong. Now the real question is this: what else can we do? Well, one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to persuade the Kurds that control much of Syria and parts of northern Iraq to invade Iran on the ground. We're telling them, if you do this, we will help you build your own state. Now, guess who the source for that information is? It was captured through signal intelligence. The Turks. Now, if you're a Turk, how do you feel about a Kurdish state emerging in the region that aspires to take almost a third of your country? And just a few weeks ago, we had a situation where a group of Kurds, about 400 of them, armed to the teeth, were organized and sent into action to cross the Iranian border by the Israelis, by the Mossad. The Turks informed the Iranians of this, and the Iranians annihilated the 400. So I think what you're going to see now increasingly is greater cooperation between Turkey and Iran. Turkey has the largest army in NATO. Turkey is a modern state with modern armed forces. And the Turks are already very unhappy about what the Israelis have done in Syria. The Israelis have taken much of southern Syria and continue to push towards Damascus. So I guess what I'm saying is that we are now looking around for other ways to attack Iran. Is that evidence for success with the air and missile strikes? I don't think so.
One thing that I'm very curious about is, so it seems like this is going to have very big ramifications on the world oil market. And two beneficiaries of Iran's oil market is Russia and China. At what point do the bigger superpowers join this fight? I know that China is supplying weapons and planes right now, but at what point does especially China get more involved in the action, do you think?
Well, right now, to compensate for the 2.7 million barrels of oil a day that India receives from the Persian Gulf, the Indians are buying oil from Russia. China is buying oil from Russia. Japan is buying oil from Russia. So I think we can say at this point that this is a bonanza financially for Russia. They're making more money than they've ever made from the oil and natural gas market. They have a new pipeline, straight into China. And they are doubling down to pipe as much oil and natural gas into China as possible to compensate for at least the temporary loss of oil and gas from the Persian Gulf, because China gets roughly a third of all of its oil and gas from the Persian Gulf. However, we should point out that China stored up a great deal of oil and gas. In other words, they have reserves, and they built those reserves up against the very high probability that this would be cut off by us. So I think, at least for the moment, Russia and China are fine. The rest of us, not so good. Europe in particular is in serious trouble because we destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline, and we insisted the Europeans not take oil and natural gas from Russia. So they followed suit. They're not taking oil and natural gas from Russia. Now they've lost their access to oil and natural gas from the Middle East. So what do you do in Europe? Well, I guess you wait for the summer. You may not be able to do any work at night because you won't have any electricity. Look, what I'm trying to illustrate is that everything we have done has been done in a vacuum. We have ignored the interests of our friends and allies. We don't care what happens to the Turks. We don't care what happens to the Indians. We don't care what happens to the Europeans. The only thing we seem to care about is Israel.
How does the United States benefit from this conflict in any manner?
It doesn't. That was my point. If I'm projecting into the future, I think that by the time this is over, we'll be finished in the region. Nobody's going to invite us back in to build bases. Why would you want a base that belongs to the United States inside your country? Did we protect these bases? No, we couldn't. So what's happened to the bases? They're destroyed. What's happened to other facilities on the ground in these various places across the Middle East? They're being destroyed. So I don't see much evidence that we're going to be welcome there much longer. In fact, if you're sitting in Korea right now and you're already fed up with the way we've been treating them, and you want to get us out of your country, but you're too polite to say, please leave, I think the South Koreans are going to look at the situation and decide, look, these Americans haven't been very successful at protecting anybody. They can't protect their own bases. They certainly can't protect the Israelis. So just why do we have the Americans in South Korea? Because we don't expect an attack from North Korea. And right now, South Korea's largest trading partner is China. And the Chinese don't like North Korea. Nobody likes North Korea. You don't buy anything from North Korea. North Korea doesn't build anything to sell to anybody. So what would the Chinese like to do? They would like to see South Korea ultimately take ownership of North Korea. But that's impossible as long as we are on the peninsula. But people say, well, wait a minute, the Chinese want to invade South Korea. No, they don't. Why? Why would they do that? The same thing is true with Taiwan. For God's sakes, they don't want a war over Taiwan. A war with Taiwan would destroy business, destroy the economy. There's no value in seizing control of Taiwan. They've made it very clear the only way that they end up invading Taiwan is if we put missiles and troops on Taiwan. Sound familiar? So, the world has changed. It's 80 years since the end of the Second World War. People are still running around saying, well, if the Iranians get the nuclear bomb, they'll attack us right away. No, they won't. But that's good Israeli Jewish propaganda. That's designed to buttress support for this war to destroy Iran. And remember, what's the war about? Have you looked at the Greater Israel Project? Have you seen the map? The map takes Sinai. It takes part of northern Egypt. It seizes part of Jordan. It seizes most or half of Syria as a minimum, part of Iraq, northern Saudi Arabia. This is what we're fighting for?
So it seems like this is a battle that is supposed to help Israel become a world superpower while depleting the United States, which it doesn't seem like Israel has any objectives that align with helping us. It's more so they're using us as a big bully to help do what they want in the neighborhood.
Of course. And since they've got control of Congress and the White House, who's to stop them?
So I think it brings up some interesting questions of free speech. I know that Colonel Nathan McCormick, was recently let go for saying that he doesn't want to fight for the Israeli death cult and suggesting that the United States is Israel's proxy. There's also rumors that the USS Gerald R. Ford is sabotaging its plumbing because they don't want to fight the war for Israel. I don't know if you have any sources on that, but if a soldier refuses an order because they don't want to die for Israel, what are the ramifications for that soldier?
Well, first, I can't confirm any of what you said except the first point. We know about that individual, and he expressed his views, and I don't think he's the Lone Ranger. Mm-hmm. But I think most everyone else, having served in the regular army for 28 years after West Point, is going to follow orders unless you are asked to commit an atrocity. Now, where do you draw the line? Well, I certainly would not assist the Israelis in their program of mass murder and deportation of Palestinians from Gaza or the West Bank. It's off the table. And if I were sitting in the Senate or the House, I would insist that we stop aiding and supporting Israel as long as it pursues those policies. I mean, to me, that just makes sense based upon the things we say we stand for in the United States. But as far as the rest of it is concerned, I think it's always important that the soldier in the field, sailor, airman, or Marine, feels that he is acting in the interests of the American people. It's become increasingly difficult to make that argument. We made that argument in Vietnam, and it was always a lie. We've made the argument in many other settings, and it was not necessarily true. Now, in 1990, that argument was made, but there were limitations on the application of American military power. And that limitation at the time was we are not marching into Iraq with the goal of changing Iraq and regime change. We simply said we're ejecting the Iraqi military from Kuwait. Now, some of us think that we should have done more than we did, but nonetheless, those were the limitations. And I think that went well. It went rather easily compared with everybody's expectation. But then again, we had generals that hadn't been to war since the 1960s. And they saw Vietnam, and that was a very different setting. Right now, I think most Americans in uniform and out of uniform are looking at this, and they're asking some of these questions. But I don't think the majority are asking them and expecting immediate answers. So I think, sadly, this will have to drag on for some period of time. And if it drags on and we get some number of Americans killed, and by some number, 500 at a shot, 1,000 at a shot, something like that, some mass casualty event, it will be much harder for this administration to make an argument for a long-term strategic conflict.
Do you think that Trump can be impeached for not getting congressional approval to go into this war in the first place?
Well, I think that's possible, but I think that's kind of a joke. It's an exercise in extraordinary hypocrisy. The only time the Democrats stood up and gave a standing ovation to Donald Trump during the State of the Union speech was when he talked about attacking Iran. Gee, I wonder why. Everybody's on the payroll. Everybody's getting their check in the mail. So they all stood up and, yes, let's go get Iran. Sorry about that. It's depressing. So if they do that, it's just an exercise in hypocrisy. They've failed the American people themselves. It's their obligation to exercise their constitutional duty. They haven't done it.
If you were to hear from the Department of War, our Navy is the strongest, most powerful, most tremendous. What do you think is the true state of the U.S. Navy right now? And how do we stand to fight in this war?
Well, we have 3 more carrier battle groups. And as I understand it, they are being prepared to surge to the Middle East. If they do, they will not all be at full strength, and they will not all be adequately prepared. Now, I think we have 11 carriers. We have 2 carrier battle groups right now, one in the Mediterranean and one down in the Indian Ocean. These other 3, I don't know where they are precisely. But I think the point is the Navy is not in good shape. And that has been a problem for some time because the admirals refuse to let go of the Cold War paradigm. We keep ships at sea long, long beyond the limits that are normal and are necessary. We patrol seas and oceans where there is nothing. We don't need to be there. We have satellite-based overhead intelligence, terrestrial intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance. We don't need to be everywhere as we have been in the past. And as a result, you have a Navy that's worn out. The equipment is worn out, and people in many cases are not adequately trained. They haven't had time to train. So I think there are serious problems, morale, training, and discipline in the Navy. Now, how about the rest of the force? It's a mixed picture. I think the Air Force probably has the least difficulties. but that has to do with their lifestyle and the way they operate. Whereas the Army and the Marines, I think they have their share of problems as well. Now, we have had recruiting difficulties, in large part because people were tired of rotating in and out of these forward operating bases where they saw no particular mission. So I think there are a lot of problems, and we keep pretending that we are so, I listened to President Trump say, well, I rebuilt it during the last administration, and now our military is greater than ever. He doesn't have any idea. Trump is a marketing genius. He got where he did in business because he was very good at persuading people, to invest in him, to believe him. He's carried that over into politics, but the substance is lacking. Things are not quite as he describes them.
Colonel, you even wrote books on the subject of how the military can innovate. People have called you one of the most innovative thinkers of how the military could change. What would you prescribe for the country right now? If you became benevolent dictator, how would you handle Iran, and what would you do with our military?
Well, the first thing is I wouldn't have attacked Iran. I think it's a very stupid idea. It's always a dumb idea for a maritime or aerospace power, or in our case, we're both a maritime and aerospace power, to attack a land power, or what we call a continental power. Why? Continental powers are very large. They have strategic depth. In other words, they can fall back into their interior. They're harder to reach, especially when they have large populations. 93 million is a large population. And they have a very large pool of young men who can serve in the Iranian armed forces. That's helpful. The Turks do as well. In fact, I think both Iran and Turkey, 50 or 60% of the population is under the age of 30. That's a very fortuitous position to be in militarily. So, what are we really? We're very much like the British Empire before 1914. We sail in or we fly in, and when things go our way, we stay and try to exploit the opportunity for money. When things don't go our way, we sail home, we fly home. We stayed in Vietnam until it became impossible for us to stay there. What did we do? We sailed away, we flew away. We don't live in the Eastern Hemisphere. We don't live on the Asian continent. We don't live in Europe. We don't live in Africa. We don't live in Latin America. So, whatever we do is temporary. It's not an enduring impact. What we do is we disturb the dynamic for some period of time, we try to profit from it, and then we leave. This is the problem, though, in the modern world. That old model of profiting, which was really a form of imperialism, doesn't work. And it's a loser, especially if you're trying to hold territory. My point is this. We need to leave the world to its own devices. We need to focus here at home. We need to treat the rest of the world not as an enemy, just as a normal person would treat another normal person. But we should also look at states as potential strategic partners depending on circumstances. I like to call relations between nations limited liability partnerships. You cooperate together when it makes sense to do so. But you don't set up alliances that are supposed to be permanent, that bind small states to us or bind us to them. In other words, work together when you can, but it doesn't necessarily mean that our interests align perfectly. One of the major crusades of the Israeli state and its supporters in the United States has been to create the illusion that whatever Israel's interests are and whomever Israel fights is somehow or another our enemy, and it's in our interest to be part of it. That's not true. We don't really have an interest in war with Iran. We never have. And if you go back, and we need to pause and discuss this for just a minute. If you go back to Sam Huntington's work on Clash of Civilizations and some of his other works before that, Political Order in Changing Societies. Pardon me, I used to teach this stuff at West Point. One of the points that he made repeatedly was of all the Islamic states in the world, all, Iran was by far the most enlightened, the most advanced, with the highest human capital, and most likely to become part of the growing modern world. That is still true today. But this propaganda machine over the last 30 years has worked overtime to convince everyone in the United States who watches Fox News or CNN or ABC or MSNBC or NBC or whatever, and the 6 oligarchs, Zionist billionaires who control all the media corporations, have tried repeatedly to reinforce this enemy picture or perception of Iran. It's worked. We're finally at war with Iran. And we got a problem. First of all, we don't really think we can win it, contrary to whatever Donald Trump says publicly. Secondly, we don't know how to end it. Especially if ending it means we have to admit that we can't win.
How do you think this goes for Israel in the sense that maybe they're a little bit in over their head? They have this mentality that it's us versus the world. Everyone wants us wiped out. We're willing to use the ultimate force, a nuclear weapon. Could this get escalated into something extremely serious?
Yes, that is the greatest danger of all. I think the Russians and the Chinese will stay on the sidelines for the moment. But as it becomes clear that we can't win and the Iranians can't lose, they will become more engaged, probably with us. Initially behind closed doors, and then more so publicly if it becomes necessary. The Israelis, fearing exactly this development, may well decide to use a nuclear weapon in order to stop the Iranians from flattening their country with missiles. Because what they don't want to do is admit defeat. So then in desperation, turn to a nuclear weapon. If that were to happen, we're on the threshold of intercontinental nuclear exchanges. We don't know where it'll go. We don't know how bad it can get. I hope that President Trump has given some thought to this possibility, because he, more than anyone else, would have to personally intervene to stop it.
So essentially, unless we sort of divorce ourselves from this Israel cult thinking, things will not be good for us going forward in the future.
Well, you can't divorce yourself at the moment. We're in too deep. But the most that you can do is turn to the Israelis and say stop when the time comes. And that won't be for a little while. I think we have 10 days to 2 weeks of missiles. That's it.
What comes after? As far as what we have left in our arsenal.
Yeah, and the Israelis have less than that.
And what happens after that?
Well, that's the question. Do you finally admit this is a loss? Do you admit that you can't win? Do you turn to Moscow or Beijing or both and ask them to mediate? Better would be to turn to India. India is neutral, and India has good relations with Iran historically. It's also had good relations with Israel and us and Russia, and it has its moments with China, but not to the point where it's hopelessly hostile. Maybe India could mediate some sort of end to this disaster. But it's too soon. We're going to push this to the nth degree. It'll be pushed to as far as we can go before we stop. And then your other scenario will come into play, by the way. And that is Congress will suddenly say, this is a disaster, Donald Trump. It's all of your making. And in reality, they were as deeply involved in bringing on this war as anyone. Then the American people are going to decide whether or not they think they have a legitimate government anymore. Since the polling was 70 to 85% against the war. And if we had put this to a referendum, I doubt seriously we would be at war right now.
Colonel, I know you're probably booked all day doing hits like this. I very much appreciate your time. I'm looking forward to our Pentagon piece coming out. So thank you for joining us. One request, if you could keep the link open once we hang up this call. So
yeah, sure, absolutely. The other thing is I urge people to go to my Substack. McGregor Warrior Substack, and I've got a piece there. It's really about how long will this last and how will it end. It'll go into greater detail than we were able to in the short time we were talking. Okay?
Yes, and you'll have a link to your latest book in the description as well.
Okay.
We appreciate your time, and we will be in touch, okay?
Super. Thanks very much.